Hi, this is Pete Brown. Today we're going to look at building a first WPF application. It's going to be a simple Twitter client that uses the TweetSharp library. We're going to be doing this in .NET 4, especially given the new release of .NET 4 here, and we'll be using Visual Studio 2010. This is a nice, simple application to help you get started in using WPF. We'll teach a little bit about how to use the designer, as well as some of the basics of data binding, and then a very, very lightweight view model type approach to allow you to make the most of data binding. Okay. We're going to do this in Visual Studio 2010, and I'm going to create a new project. And this is going to be a WPF application. And let's call this first Twitter app. And we're targeting .NET 4. When you create a new project in Visual Studio, what you'll get here are a number of panels. The most important for us is this design surface in the middle. The top area here has the window that you're working on, and then the bottom area has the XAML markup for the window. Everything that you do down here in this XAML markup will be reflected in the window and vice versa. You're free to drag controls directly onto the surface of the window and have it generate the XAML for you, or you can drag controls into the XAML if that's easier for you. Or you can even go in and just manually type in controls. Say like text box, text equals hello there, and have that automatically reflected up here on the design surface. During my own work, I usually bounce back and forth between editing directly in XAML and editing on the design surface, depending upon what feels most efficient for me for the task at hand. If you're coming from the Windows Forms world, you should be pretty comfortable with the designer here. And if you're dragging things around and you're putting them on the designer, it'll also help you learn the XAML itself. All right. So this is going to be a Twitter application, and we're just going to do a couple of really basic things here. First, we're going to add a button onto our design surface. And this is the button that we're going to use to retrieve all the Twitter content, the Twitter statuses. And we're going to call this button name Get Update. And the content for that button, now a button, being that this is WPF, a button can have anything that you want for content. You can even have other buttons or list boxes or anything silly like that. But the content here is just going to be a straight string. And we're just going to put in the string update. All right. You see, as I'm typing in the property pane over on the right, it's updating both on the design surface as well as in the XAML view. So here's our content update. We see it up here, and we also see it over on the right. And if we want to change some alignment settings, let's say, well, I've got this all the way over on the right, and I'd rather it not be anchored to the left of the window. So I'm going to click this right here, and to make sure that it gets anchored to the right of the window and the top. That way, when I resize this window, it's going to resize the grid, which is going to drag this button along for the ride by anchoring it on the top and right. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is put a list box in here. Now, you'll find when working in WPF and Silverlight that you can do pretty much anything you would ever want to do with a list box. It's really one of the most versatile controls out there. So if I take this list box and just drag it into the window, position this, you see the sizes. But this list box is going to allow us to display all the tweets that we receive, and we're going to work a little bit on formatting that shortly. So let's save this. Now, the next thing that we need to do here is twofold. I'm going to add a reference to the TweetSharp library because it's a real nice library to work with when you're working with Twitter. It doesn't yet have a .NET 4 version available. They are working on one, though. Now, because of that, their particular implementation doesn't work with the client profile of .NET 4. So it references some stuff in system.web that come the .NET 4 timeframe they won't necessarily need to reference. So I need to go in and tell Visual Studio to retarget this project from the client profile to the full .NET framework. Now, in previous versions of Visual Studio and in .NET, that was actually a bit of a production. You had to go in and mess around with removing references and playing around a bit. Here, it's actually pretty easy. So I just right-click, choose Properties, And instead of targeting the client profile, I'm going to say it's going to target .NET 4. It's going to tell me that I need to go in and basically rebuild the project, and it's going to reload it for me. It gives you a little warning here telling you that you may require manual modification of the project. That's if you start referencing other libraries. For example, you're going the other way around. You're going from the full .NET framework down to the client profile. You may have to remove some references, right? Nevertheless, this is still a much simpler prospect than we had in the previous versions of .NET. All right, so that's all done. That took care of changing the references there for me. And the reason why it's so much simpler in .NET 4 is the client profile is a subset of the full .NET framework. In the previous version, it was logically a subset, but it was really treated as a whole separate framework. The next thing that we're going to do here, since we've got our XAML file with the UI on it, the next thing that we're going to do is create a data source that we can bind to. And when you're working in WPF and Silverlight, what you typically want to do is follow a pattern called the view model pattern. And now there's a wide spectrum of implementations of the view model pattern. And what I'm going to do here is really one of the very simplest implementations that really just gives you enough to abstract this information out so that you're able to successfully bind to it. So I'm going to add a folder that I just call view models. And I'm going to add a class into that I'm going to call my tweet view model. Or just Twitter view model in this case. Since we have a one-screen application, what you call a view model is really not important. But typically your view models are one-to-one with these screens or forms in your application. Now what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to create an observable collection that we're going to use to contain all the tweets. And I'm also going to add in a method that allows us to load the latest tweets. So let me add the method first. All right, and we'll just leave that empty for the moment. And now the observable collection that I've got here, I'm going to need to have it be, or have it surface a class that I'm going to create that holds the actual Twitter status. So I need to go in and create that. So I'm going to add another new folder. I'm just going to call this model. And the class that I've got here is going to be called tweet. And since I'm not editing any of the stuff here, I can use the auto properties and not have to worry about any notification changes or anything. So I can say public string text get set. And then I can do the same thing for the from name. And then the image of the person from Twitter. There we go. Now you might ask why I didn't just keep these just as regular fields instead of creating properties. But in WPF, if you want to be able to bind to something, it needs to be an actual property. The shortcut syntax here for doing these auto properties makes it quite a bit easier. Now, if you want to do property change notification, there's a bit more to it, and there's plenty of great blog posts out there as well as some videos on how to handle that. All right. Now back to our view model. All right. So I'm going to create an observable collection here. And it's going to have tweets in it. And I'm going to call that tweets. Now I need to resolve this. Right. And then I'm going to create a new instance of it. Right. Now what an observable collection lets you do is as you're modifying and adding and removing things from this, it raises the appropriate change notification so that anything that's bound to it will automatically update. Let me resolve my tweet. All right. And then I'm going to create a property to hold this. Just copy that down here. And it's going to be a read-only property, because we don't need to go and create a new instance of the collection. When you're working with data binding, there's a subtle difference between creating new instances of collections that you're bound to and adding and removing items from existing collections. For example, if I were to go in and replace the actual collection here with a new observable collection every time I loaded new tweets into this, I would need to make sure that I fired a property change notification from here so that the rest of the UI would know that this collection is in fact new. But if I keep the same instance around and instead I just go in and add new elements or remove elements from this, then the observable collection is going to take care of all the change notification for me. All right. And now we're finally down to the part where I need to call the Tweet Sharp API. So let's add that reference. I'm going to browse for that. Actually, I think I should be in my recents. Yep, Tweet Sharp and their JSON DLL. So I've got those in there. And now I'm going to use their Fluent API to be able to load tweets in. So say var Twitter equals create request statuses, because that's what I want statuses. I'm going to get all the public ones here for this first time anyway. Here we go. Actually, I need to add in a couple of usings here at the top. Their Fluent API, and then finally their model. All right. All right, so I've got these. Let me pop this down so you can see it. It's very interesting how their Fluent API works. So I say here, I'm going to call this Fluent Twitter.createRequest, and what I want statuses, and the statuses I want are the ones on the public timeline, and I want the result returned as JSON. The result type here is not super important because we're going to have it go and transform these into proper objects for us anyway. So I say var response equals Twitter.request. You saw there was an async method there if we want to do asynchronous, which is usually a good idea when you're dealing with something as iffy as Twitter. And let me get the statuses themselves as statuses. Okay. So now what we have here is we have an enumerable of Twitter status. And I want to transform that into the tweet that I have earlier. So I'm going to say for each Twitter status in statuses. Say that 10 times fast. Tweets.add new tweet. Let's see, from equals status.user.name. From image equals new URI. Status.user.profile image URL. And text equals status.text. All right. So we've looped through all the results that we've gotten, and for each one of those, we have added a new item into our observable collection. So now, if I data bind something to the observable collection, whenever this load latest tweets method is called, you'll see new elements inside there. I'm not doing anything yet at this point to deal with making sure that I'm not duplicating tweets or anything like that. Those are all certainly things that you can do later on by tracking date and time of tweets and whatnot, or IDs, and there's also some other methods as well. But we're just going to leave it like this right now. We're really only going to call this method once typically anyway. All right, let's save this. Go to our main window XAML, and let's start some binding. Now, the first thing that I want to do here is I am going to set the data context for the window. Now, there's lots of different ways of doing this. You can do it directly into XAML. Try this again. Like I'm going to do here. You can also do it in the code behind. You could do this via something called a static resource rather than doing a data context. Folks that are really into getting more advanced in the patterns like to use IOC containers to inject this in. I'm going the simple route here, which I think works for most applications that I've built in the past, real applications that are being used in production, but didn't have, really strong testing and kind of mocking requirements. This type of approach works pretty well for that. It also works really well in demos. All right, so I'm going to set the data context here. And what I'm going to set it to is the view model. And I need to set up this namespace. So I have first Twitter apps.viewModels. And what this does is this creates a custom prefix now that I can use to refer to anything that's inside this CLR namespace. So inside the data context, if I say VM:, you'll see I get my Twitter view model. All right. And so now the data context for the entire window is the view model. That means any binding statements that I type in here are going to be relative to this data context. So for example, if I type in binding and a property name, it's going to look for that property on the view model itself. All right, now we're going to go take a look in the code behind. And this is one of the places where the simple version of a view model pattern kind of falls down a little bit compared to some of the more expressive and extensive versions. I'm going to have some code in the code behind here that handles some button click type stuff. And I'm also going to have some code in here that initializes or references some methods and properties that are on the view model itself. If you go the more advanced route with the command pattern and the view model, you end up just wiring up commands, and your code behind ends up essentially empty. Now, it's rare that you will have an entire project with no code behind at all, but that's kind of the goal. And as long as you understand why you might deviate from that, then I think you're usually pretty cool. Now, all I actually really need to do here is double-click the update button, and I'll get the event handler generated for me. And I'm going to call the view model. Now, in order to get an instance of the view model, I'm going to create a property here, or excuse me, a variable here in the code behind that holds that. So I'm going to say Twitter view model. I'll need to resolve that. So resolve view models. View model equals new. Actually, I don't need to new that up. I'll do that in a second. And then inside the main window, after the initialize component call, initialize component is when all the variables that you've, or it's really all the controls that you've named inside XAML, they will be assigned to their XAML itself at runtime, their runtime instance. If you try and refer to controls before this, they'll be null, and just because they haven't been resolved yet. The code that's in there is actually just going through the XAML at runtime, doing a find name, and then creating, assigning that to the generated variable names. So I say view model equals Twitter view model, this data context. There we go. And now in the get update click, I can say view model dot load latest tweets. All right. So now if I click the button, I'll load the latest tweets, but we still haven't bound up the UI. So let's go back over to the XAML here. And if I look inside the list box, I can go over here to the right and change the binding information. And you see here's the tweets collection that we had. If we wanted to bind to an item in there and the particular values that are in there, that would be okay. But we want to bind to the collection itself, so I simply select tweets and then go here. And you see it generated the item source binding statement for you. Now, one of the most difficult things to learn when you're first starting off in WPF is the binding syntax. Once you get it under your belt, it's pretty easy. But there's great IntelliSense support in here so that you can go through and make any changes that are necessary. But also in Visual Studio 2010 with the ability to bind things directly from the property pane makes it much easier for you to be able to create this without having to think about what's involved in there. All right, so let's make sure that we're kosher with the code. And let's start this up. Now call the update method. You see all we have here is the result of calling toString on our tweet class. Now you can fix that if you want by going into the tweet class that you have and making it so the toString returns something useful. Or another thing that you can do is you can go in and create what's called a data template for your list box. What this did let us do, though, is that we can look at that and see that everything is actually working, which is good. Now, the data template itself, there's a little bit more to that than what you might normally do with a list box. Because what we want to have is we want to have an image, we want to have the text of the tweet as well as the name of the person who tweeted it. So we're going to go into this list box. We're going to say listbox.item template. And it's going to be a data template. And now in here, we're going to add an image and a couple of text blocks. So here's a text block, here's a text block, and here's an image. Let's stick that inside what's called stack panel. Right. And now we haven't bound the image yet, but we have bound our list box, and the list box understands what's inside tweets. So if I go into the image here, and then I go to bind its source, I can apply data binding, and you'll see I get the image property there, which is good. And the text block, I'm going to do the same thing with this first one here, and it's just going to have, for the text property, it's going to have the name of the person, so from. And then for this text block, it's going to have the actual text. There we go. And now for this text block, this last text block, we also need to wrap the text. So let's go down to text wrapping, and we're going to change that to wrap, because that could be multi-lined. All right, so what this has done now is we have a stack panel, which is just going to lay these things out one after another, nothing fancy. And it's going to show the image by binding the URL, which was just a string that we converted to a URI. It's going to bind that to the image and actually just download and display the image at that point. And then we're going to show the from text as well as the text of the message itself. All right, and that's all inside this list box. Now, I will say one thing. If you are interested in doing really fancy data templates, I would recommend going into Expression Blend, because it does have pretty good support for editing those inline. But you can certainly do them here, and I'll show you another trick just very shortly for how you can do that without leaving Visual Studio. We'll call update. And you see, it's pretty ugly, but we do have all the images and stuff in there. Now we need to make this look much better. That's also the public timeline, by the way. That's not my own timeline. We'll get to individual timelines here shortly. All right, so one of the tricks that you can do to make it easier for you to design data templates inside Visual Studio and WPF4 is use a user control. So if I were to take this whole thing and cut that out, right-click on here and add a new item, user control, and I'm going to call this tweet template. All right. And inside this tweet template, I'm just going to paste in the stuff that we had from there. I'm going to get rid of this stack panel. I'm going to move things down a little bit. I'm also just going to go and quickly change some of these properties here. So like the design height, I think only needs to be like 70 or so, and design width maybe 250. All right. And now the images themselves, you see that they're all in here. They have no size associated with them yet. All right. So let's go in and break this up a little bit. So there's our first column that we're going to have on our grid that's going to contain the image. All right, we're going to take our from text here and size it down just a little bit so it fits in there. Put in that. All right, and then we'll take our message text here, size that. We'll take our image that's over here and put it into the grid itself. So do that, resize it, and we'll get it in there. Okay, and what that did is it generated an image with a vertical alignment here, bottom, which we can adjust here if we want afterwards, but it actually has a row span of 2, so it's going to span both of these rows. Just to verify, our from text is right there, and the to text is right there. Now we've got this tweet template. Let's go back to our main window.xaml. Now to reference something external again, we need to add in a namespace. And since this is in a different folder than the view models, we need to have a new namespace for it. Since in C# you get a new namespace for each folder. I'm just going to call it local. Namespace first Twitter app. There we go. And then down here we can say local tweet template. Now the nice thing about this is because this is inside our data template, the data context for our user control is going to be automatically set to the individual tweet. So we don't actually have to do anything else there to set up the data context. As a matter of fact, if you mess around with the data context inside the user control, it gets really messy, so I don't recommend doing that at all. Probably the only other thing I would add here is let's give it a margin so that we have a little bit of breathing room between each tweet. And what that margin equals 10 does is it gives us a equal margin of 10 on each side. If we want to have it different, we can either space or comma delimit the 4 sides on that. So let's build this. Let me go to the window here and there we go. Oops. And let's start. All right. Update that. And we should get back a reasonably decent formatted list of tweets. All right, all good. Now let's go ahead and get the list of tweets for a particular person. So I'm going to add in a couple of labels here. Then I'm going to add in a text box and a password box. And what we're going to get here is a username and password. Now, one of the interesting things about the password box is you can't data bind to it. That was put in there just as a security restriction. So we're going to have to write a little bit of code behind to get that information over. I can take this label here, and I want it to be snapped to the baseline, which you see that line going across is the text baseline. So my text is automatically aligned. Keep that there. And I'm going to add the text for this is going to say username. So I need to give that a little bit more room, don't I? And the text for this is going to say password. You see I can snap that to the other controls that I have there, and it tells me some information about the spacing between them. For example, you see it's 15 pixels after the end of password, and it's 18 pixels between username and password. I can select both of these if I want. Oops. Let me reset that. There we go. I can select both of those, and I can nudge them up and do things like you would normally expect to. Now the username here, we're going to use data binding, and the password we're going to use code behind. So let's go back to our view model, and let's add in some properties to hold the username and password. So private string username and private string password. Now, interestingly, I can just go in here and I can refactor this. I'm going to say encapsulate the field. Yep, username is the property name I want. Bam, I've got the property in there. And password, I can do the same thing. Refactor, encapsulate field, password. Now, technically, these can change in the code behind, so what you are inside the view model. So what you would probably want to do is add in a notify property change statement in here. But again, that's not necessary for what we're going to be doing here. Right. The other thing that I need to do is now that we have a username and password property is I need to make some changes into the load latest tweets method to be able to pull in information for a specific user. Now, what's really kind of nice is right after create request here, I can just say dot authenticate as, and I can say username, password. Easy as that. All right. Now let's go bind those up. If we go, well, we're going to have to build before we do that. Okay. Now, if we take this username text box, the text property that's down here, I want to have that be bound. So I'm going to apply data binding. And you see it automatically picked up all the properties of the view model, and it's going to be bound to username. And now the password text box I'd mentioned, you can't bind to that. So inside this update call, I'm simply going to say view model dot password equals password box one dot password. Right? Normally you want to avoid these types of property assignments when you're working inside WPF, but in cases where something specifically doesn't allow binding, you don't have much choice. You can create a binding helper class. I've seen some examples of those online that are pretty slick, but again, for a demo, that's a little much. So simply using a left to right here binding would be fine. All right. Let's try this out and see what we get. So username, use mine, and then my password. Maybe you can guess by my typing. I call update, and it's going to get the tweets from my timeline. It actually didn't. Oh, you know why? There we go. There's one other change I need to make. If I go to the view model here, instead of on the public timeline, I need to get the user timeline on. There we go. Let's do that again. I didn't recognize the pictures that are on there. I was pretty sure they weren't me. Update that. And there we go. Pretty neat. Now, you notice it didn't wrap very well here. What you can do is you need to assign an actual width to the elements that are inside the list box. Otherwise, they're going to expand automatically, and that's easy enough to fix. But you see it bound here showed the image, showed the name of the person who did the post, as well as the actual text that's coming through here. Thank you for watching.